Our scripture reading today comes from Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. I'm reading from the New International Version. It's entitled The Birth of Moses. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe. Her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water."
Good morning. Good morning. Do you ever notice that people really love a good underdog story? I sure do. And it's not just a worldwide phenomenon either. It's actually as old and as storytelling itself. It's an ancient thing, these sorts of underdog stories. What has changed, though, over the course of the development of stories, especially for us, is how low you could start out in this kind of story. You know, when we watch movies like The Blind Side and we see an underdog story like this homeless teenager that becomes a professional football player, we think, that's pretty low. You know, that guy came up from the slums, right? But when we watch the movie Slumdog Millionaire and we see the slums of Mumbai, we think that it couldn't hardly get any worse than that for someone, could it? Could a hero really come from somewhere that bad? But the depths of these really don't even begin to scratch the surface of where Moses starts out. Not only was he a member of an oppressed people who were suffering under the crippling burden of slavery, an order had gone out to kill all the babies of the Hebrews. So these Egyptian midwives had tried were ordered to kill these babies during the delivery process. And some of them refused to completely carry that out. But that's a horrible thing to be charged with. And so Moses' mother kept her pregnancy a secret, probably hearing about this and probably afraid that her child would be killed. She knew that she couldn't keep a crying baby a secret forever. So she was truly in some really desperate circumstances. You know, one thing when we read about this story or hear about this story in Sunday school that we never hear about is the fact that people would take an unwanted baby, instead of having an abortion in a quiet place like we might have in our culture, they would actually take the baby out into the wilderness of some kind and leave the baby out there to die of exposure. That was the fate of an unwanted baby. Well, every now and then a baby would probably be rescued, 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100 or some statistic like that. That wouldn't be the case. And so Moses' mother didn't just put him in a little raft so she could go for her work day and come up and pick him up when she got off of her shift here. She walked away perhaps thinking that this was the last time she would ever see her baby. She was probably so desperate that she put her baby out on the river as a method of exposure. So let's not forget that the Nile River is a place where crocodiles live, right? I mean, this is no small thing. But Moses' mother didn't put her baby in the rapids, you know. She placed her son in the reeds. And Moses' sister watched her do this and hung out to see what would happen to her little brother. Can you imagine standing in her shoes as your mother did this and watching to see what happened? I mean, that's a thing that we don't think about when we hear this story as children. For us, a typical hero would be someone like Captain America, you know, somebody who was kind of a weak person who later became strong, someone who experienced kind of bullying and suffering, and then later has the strength to rise up and bring about a sense of justice in some way. You know, but the typical archetypal hero in the ancient world would actually be something a lot more like Moses, a baby that was expected to die of exposure, but would be given a second chance to come back and change the world. Believe it or not, there are actually multiple old ancient stories that have a very similar theme as this story of Moses. One of them is the story of King Sargon of Akkad. And he was also put in a bitumen-sealed basket and floated in a river and saved by a stranger who was a kind-hearted stranger, later went on to do great things. And a lot of people are skeptical. They think that really the story of Moses is just kind of a rip-off of this other story that they borrowed from it. But Moses' story makes Sargon's story look like just a little tiny, it's not nearly as dramatic, it's not nearly as exciting. And just because this story is kind of archetypal doesn't mean that it isn't true or based on something true. You know, an underdog story doesn't connect with us because things like that never happen. It connects with us because every once in a while, something like this does happen. Some person who was going to be abandoned or was given up on the world come back and change the world, made it a better place. You know, and I connect with this, you know, as a person whose mother had given up on me. I don't know, you probably don't know, but I was 4 pounds 9 ounces when I was born. My mother, she drank and did a lot of drugs when I was in her womb. She at times even did so in excess, hoping that it would result in my abortion. And the doctors, when I was born, they thought that maybe I would have fetal alcohol syndrome, that I would lack the motor skills to be able to even lift my own head, and that perhaps I'd be mentally handicapped my entire life. And I guess that's kind of up to you to decide how that turned out. But I connect with this story on a gut level. You know, this is kind of my story. I look at Moses' story, or Jesus' story, as he enters the world in these dangerous circumstances. So a baby in facing dangerous circumstances, facing these world forces converging and bringing about the death of babies in this crazy situation, that's not just an Old Testament story. That's a New Testament story. Jesus was also whisked off to Egypt to flee a genocide, the hands of an evil and dangerous king. And Moses, in some ways, is a Christ-like figure. You know, he was someone who God called to do great things. Moses, like Jesus, grew up to be a liberator, a person used by God to deliver people from slavery. Of course, Jesus delivered us from the slavery of sin. But still, it's a lot in common. Moses, like Jesus, experienced adversities that we could scarcely imagine. But Moses wasn't paradoxically both fully God and fully man. Moses has all the struggles of humans that we do, and Jesus did too. I mean, to be fair, Jesus identified with us in every way. But when we try to follow Jesus, sometimes we look at him like he's kind of a superhero, like it's impossible for us, because of our humanity, to really follow him in ways that we can truly connect with. But when we look at Moses' story, we don't have that problem. Because Moses did some really boneheaded things that I think we can all relate to at various points. Moses isn't some kind of superhero that just has this kind of perfection that we could never muster, that rises to a level that we can never attain. Moses is somebody who did great things with God's help, but somebody who was broken. We get to see pictures of Moses' anger, pictures of Moses' sin. We get to see Moses' naked humanness, his struggle to follow God through his insecurities and fears in ways that we never get to see Jesus do. So we see God, the deliverer, deliver a whole people through this broken man who tries to follow him, choosing to use humans in his plans that are bigger than any human could ever imagine. So I think perhaps it's time to take a fresh look at Moses, the man who walked so close to the Lord that his face shone like the sun. And this sermon series really is looking forward to God's encounter with Moses at the burning bush, where Moses asks these questions of God that we each, as we come to God, ask in our own way, that speak to our condition, that we are seeking answers to. But I just don't feel like we can start out there. We just can't jump straight to the burning bush. We need to know who Moses is. We need to understand where he's coming from. And not just the sanitized version that we hear in Sunday school either, the real Moses, who really struggled. These stories that we hear as children, we think that we just kind of leave them behind as we grow up. But really those stories grow up with us. Those stories have a whole lot more that's in that sanitized children's version of the Bible that we read when we were 6 or 7. So I want to introduce you to the real Moses, not the kid fairy tale Moses, but the real Moses. And so as children, we don't really ponder things like the mystery of God's sovereignty. We don't see him using people like Pharaoh's daughter unawares. We don't think about that. We don't think about children being exposed to death or being at a place where crocodiles live. We're not really in a position to think about how Moses' mother felt when she walked away from the river that day and she left her child behind. When we're children, we can't think about these things. When we come back to the story as adults with a fresh set of eyes, suddenly this stuff comes to life for us. And so Moses' mother may have been attempting to expose her baby, but she did it in a way that kind of gave her baby a good shot, I guess. She put the baby in a basket that was very similar to the same kinds of baskets that the Egyptians used when they would actually float idols down the river. So it's something that the Egyptians would be attracted to. But I don't know if that's really a good idea in a place where Egyptians are killing Hebrew babies, So it would draw Egyptian attention. And she didn't put the basket in the rapids, she put the basket in the reeds. And the story never tells us if Moses' mother was clever enough to plan this whole thing out, if she had scoped out to see where Pharaoh's daughter bathed and thought this whole thing through and conspired to come up with this grand scheme. It doesn't really say that. But one possible reason that Pharaoh's daughter would have taken baby Moses home with her is because when she was probably going down to the river to pray to her gods to bring about this fertility ritual, she could have been going to the river asking for a baby that day. And maybe God gave her one. But however God did it, this story is really a demonstration of God's sovereignty. It's a demonstration of the fact that God had called Moses up of all his people to be set apart, to live an uncommon life, to be a testament of these major events that God was doing to bring about his story of salvation to the world, to bring people out of slavery, to bring a nation into being. And also I think the story of Moses reveals something that many of us take for granted, that sometimes God can take a desperate and hard and difficult situation and turn it into an unexpected blessing. Just like Jacob or Joseph or many others in the Bible, God is at work behind the scenes. God is taking something that Pharaoh meant for evil, turning it into something that's good. So Moses' parents probably hid him for 3 months, refusing to obey these unjust laws that were in the land, and then came to this point where they just couldn't get away with it anymore. They just couldn't do it anymore, and so they, in their half-hearted way, decided to do this, to put their baby in the river. But Moses' mother, she handed her child over to God to float down the river, to walk away from him forever. God is the God who turned that back around, gave her baby back to him, nursing underneath the protection of the very people that she was trying to save him from. That's the kind of God that we serve. So just as Moses' mother comes to that drastic point where she was willing to do this crazy thing, God steps in. Just when she comes to the end of herself, God comes in and saves the day. And so God that draws Moses out of the water. And later, God would call Moses to draw his people out of slavery. So what does that mean for us here in the 21st century? You know, you or I might never be remembered like people like Moses or Jesus. You know, they're probably never going to make Christian Bale or Charlton Heston act our part in a movie someday, right? But just like Moses and Jesus, God is calling people to come out of slavery. He's using us to do it. He's calling us to be a people who lead others out of darkness, out of the difficult and desperate circumstances created by the sin that's at war in their hearts. And just like Moses, God has great things in store for us, things beyond what we could ever imagine for ourselves. And just like Moses, when God taps us on the shoulder and tells us about this wonderful plan for our life, we resist. We make excuses. We stand before God with all these reasons why it would never work. We think that if we screw up really bad and run away, that God will give up on us. But God doesn't really give up on anyone, does he? Jesus said that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, and to set the oppressed free. And God says to Moses, tell Pharaoh to let my people go. Maybe this morning he's telling us that we as his people, in our own way, are called to do the same. We are in our own way to be a people who've been plucked from the river of life, not just for our own purposes, but for purposes greater than our own. Greater than a life that would be over before we knew it. God has a special plan for us. And we, in our own way, are called with God's help to point others on this path of freedom. So I just want to encourage you to think about that. Jesus was a liberator. Moses was a liberator. But God calls all of us as his witnesses to play a part in that as well. So hopefully as we look at the story of Moses, we can see our part to play as we seek to follow him. So we're going to go into a time of open worship and time of waiting for God to move and speak. And if you feel God tapping you on the shoulder this morning, I just ask that you be faithful. But it's okay if it's a silent time. It's okay if you feel called to share. If you feel called to share, please stand and a microphone will be brought to you.